Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's program. We have a very special guest with us, Dr. Marc Robinson. He is Assistant Professor of History. He earned his PhD in American Studies from Washington State University in 2012. His research focuses on the civil rights and Black Power movements in the Pacific Northwest. He has a forthcoming book. It's titled Evergreen Ungawa, the Black Student Union of Seattle. The University of Washington and Washington State University, 1968 to 1970. It will be published as part of the Black Power series of New York University Press. It is the first monograph to uncover the inspiring activism and outstanding contributions of the Black Student Union in the state of Washington. This organization of intrepid college students spearheaded a number of racial injustice campaigns, including a Seattle-wide youth outreach program, a sit-in and occupation of the University of Washington President's Office, confrontations with law enforcement in rural Washington, and successful initiatives for Black studies and other reforms in higher education. We just have, before we get to the film, we're going to do a quick land acknowledgement, and then I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Robinson, who will give some introductory remarks to foreground the discussion for the film. So we recognize that California State University, San Bernardino sits on the territory of the ancestral lands of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University, San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university relationship to Native peoples by offering this land acknowledgement. We affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University, San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Robinson.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. Thank you, Robbie, for the introduction. And thank you to all the organizers for this program. It's an honor to be back with the Conversations on Race and Policing series. I, of course, was part of the team last summer. And so I was really pleased to be invited to come back as a panelist and kind of speaker for this evening, this afternoon, or for this event this afternoon. Let me also thank the audience, right? Hello, everybody out there. You took some time out of your day to be here, and I appreciate your attention. You know, being educated, getting informed can be a form of activism, right? You know, particularly if it's information and education with an eye towards justice and a heart and an open mind. And so I think it's important that you all are here, and I really appreciate your time as well. So again, my name is Marc Robinson. I'm a history professor here at Cal State San Bernardino. I teach courses on U.S. and African American history, and this is my third year here at our institution. So for the program for this afternoon, we're going to be watching a film, Slavery by Another Name. And so that's going to take up 90 minutes of our time, which is going to be the majority of our time. And so it's a great film. I want to start off by giving some opening remarks, kind of introducing the film. And I also want to give us a little bit of homework, so I'll talk about that in a moment. Then we're going to show the film, which of course will be a big piece of our evening. And then after the film's over, I'm going to come back and we're going to engage in some conversation. I'm going to offer some thoughts kind of after the film to kind of get us started. So that's basically our plan for the program. As I said, in a minute, I'm going to kind of give us an exercise kind of thing to get us started. So if you want to grab a piece of paper or perhaps open up a document on your computer, you'll be ready when I get to that in a moment. Okay, so about the film. Slavery by Another Name, of course, is the name of the documentary. It is based on a book by the same title, right? So in 2008, an author by the name of Douglas Blackman published a book about the same topic, which the documentary is based off of. And the book was actually based off of an earlier kind of journalistic piece that Douglas Blackman wrote earlier. So if you're interested to learn more, I definitely recommend the book. I've used it in class before. And so, again, it's the same name. Definitely check that out. What is the book and the film about? So the film is about convict leasing and related policies, right, and related history. So just kind of briefly, what is convict leasing? Okay, well, we know what convicts are. People who have been locked up, often in prison or jails for some kind of crime or some kind of prosecution, whether that be justified or not. So that's the convict part. Leasing. Okay, well, we know what that is too, right? If you are going to go to a store or you sign a lease when you move into your apartment, what are you doing? You're renting that apartment or you're renting that car when you sign the automobile lease, right? So believe it or not, human beings in the form of prisoners were leased in the same way that today we would think of signing a lease for an apartment. And so, clearly there's an issue of dehumanization just in the very idea of this policy. But despite what seems to be glaring to us today, this convict leasing system existed in our country, largely in the South, throughout the South, from approximately the end of the Civil War till World War II, right? So that's about an 80-year span of time. For about 80 years, around 1860s to the 1940s, we had this system in our country. So the film is going to give us lots of details to explore what that means, what that looked like, and the various injustice related. Let me say a couple of things, just some themes to keep in mind and to think about as we watch the film. Two things really briefly. One is this is a part of our history that happened after slavery, right? This is post-slavery, of course, after the Civil War. And so it's an example that reflects how the history of injustice in our country really goes beyond the slavery period. Of course, that period itself is very influential, in many ways. We're still living through the aftermath of that. But we also want to recognize that there's many things that happened in our nation's history that helped to shape who we are today that actually happened after slavery was over. And so this moment that we perhaps want to think about as being the great breakthrough, right? The Emancipation Proclamation and, all of these changes that happened. Unfortunately, although there were some breakthroughs, the injustice continued in some ways, and convict leasing is an example of that. So, thinking about how it connects to today, my second thing to think about is how when it comes to the system of mass incarceration, the system of a racialized criminal justice system, the origins of that is complex, of course, and there are various factors. But one of the key turning points in that history is, again, this convict leasing system, right? And so as we think about the issues around policing and law enforcement and mass incarceration today, we can look back to this period and this convict leasing system as an important point in getting us to this point that we see now, right? An important point in history where we see this trajectory unfold. Because just briefly, during the slavery system, before the Civil War, we really didn't have an emphasis on prisons and locking people up or prosecuting people for crimes during the slavery period. That really wasn't the way in which society was functioning. Of course, there was other ways, particularly forced labor, outside of a jail context that was operating at that time. So, thinking about connections to today, I think that's another, both those points, right? This is sort of after slavery, and this is sort of part of the history of the issues around policing and jails that we see now. Let's keep those two things in mind. So as we transition to start the film, here's the homework, right? So as you watch the film, what I'd like you to do on your piece of paper or on your tablet or perhaps in a Word document is to think about three things. And maybe I want you to write the word what. I want you to write the word gut, so what, and question. Okay, so for the what section, I want you to think about, what is something or some things that stand out to you about the film. As you watch, kind of jot down, what's a moment that really strikes you. The second part, gut, kind of like your stomach or your gut, what's your gut reaction? How do you feel as you're watching it? How do you feel in the pit of your stomach or in your heart? Kind of what's the emotional reaction? You want to just jot down kind of as you watch, kind of what that is as we're watching the film together. And then the so what part is, why do you think this is significant, right? And so perhaps as you're watching, or maybe at the end, can you jot down some comments around, kind of what's coming to your mind as you watch this film, and the kind of so what? Why does it matter? Why should we be remembering this today? And then the question, if you want to ask me a question or you have a question that comes that we can discuss, you can just use that space to write down a question or two. So again, it's what, gut, so what, and question. So I'd like you to kind of jot down some things as you watch, and that can be a part of our conversation after the film, after we watch the film. So with that being said, I will go ahead and cue up the film. Welcome back. Of course, we just finished watching the film Slavery by Another Name. For my co-organizers, for the organizers who are behind the scenes, if you can't hear me, let me know. But I will guess that I'm coming through okay and that all the technical side is functioning. So we have some time now for some Q&A, for some conversation. And so we want to transition to that. As we do, though, I'd like us to pause, and I'm saying the audience and I and the organizers, I think it's important to pause and to just sit in this moment, right? Thinking about what we just saw, this story of brutality and injustice, and so much tragedy. I think it's important to take a moment of silence or take a moment of reflection. And so I want us to just be in this space for a moment. And I think it's also important as we think about the stories that we just learned and such of this history of our past, which is so troubling on so many levels. I think we can also think about what's happening right now with this pandemic. We just had the 500,000 mark of those who have died in this country. Of course, there's many others who have perished around the world. And then within that 500,000 in the United States, the impacts on communities of color and African Americans are particularly heartbreaking. So we can think about that as we pause. And then, of course, there are so many cases of police brutality or the killing of unarmed African Americans, things happening in the news about investigations that have been dropped or other kinds of disappointments. There's so many issues happening in our nation and in our world where there's so much hurting and so much tragedy. And so sometimes in the academic world and universities, we don't take enough space to just kind of let that emotional side, let that tragedy, honoring people we've lost. We don't do that. So if you just bear with me, let's just take a few moments of silence. Thank you. Hopefully, that moment of silence kind of helps us as we process both our own reaction and remembering and honoring those who have lost their lives through this history that we just learned, as well as through the other things that are troubling our world today. So before we started the film, I asked everyone to maybe jot down what is something that stood out to you about the film. I asked maybe to jot down a gut reaction. So perhaps you could write something down now, or you did as you were watching. Think about the so what, or kind of why do you feel this is important? What do you think we should take away from this film? And then perhaps a question. And so we'll use that as a way of getting the conversation started in the time that we have left together. So perhaps if you want to go ahead and use the Q&A function in the Zoom, you can put down perhaps your gut reaction or your question, as we get started. And then I will ask, go ahead and do that while I give a few different remarks. Based on the film, I want to just comment a couple quick things. So you can go ahead and start typing in your comments. As you do that, I'm going to ask for the co-organizers, if you guys could just kind of like help me out by, looking at the Q&A and kind of interjecting those for me so that I can kind of, I guess I'd appreciate a little bit of help on the tech side. So I ask that for the co-organizers, please. You guys can help me out with the Q&A. So in terms of my comment about this film, before we started the film, I talked about how, this is an important moment of our history because really we're talking about after the Civil War, some of these things that were really new, right? The expansion of this racialized criminal justice system that's targeting Black folks. That's really something that we really hadn't had before, right? Where we have, expanding populations with 90% or this overwhelming Black population in prison, and of course in this debt peonage and convict leasing system, that was totally new, right? During the slavery period, that was not a crucial part of how the society was functioning. And so I think it's really interesting to think about how, what happened in our nation's history after slavery that continued the kinds of injustice that we associate with earlier. So I think that's really important. I wanted to hit on that again. And kind of branching off of that, right, the idea of African Americans as being criminal, right, the criminalization of African Americans, in some ways, sadly, that's ubiquitous to us today, right? The idea that African Americans are perceived as thugs and threatening or seen as, drug dealers or gang members or something, that has become such a norm for us today. We may not recognize that, earlier, say during the slavery period, African Americans were not seen as, violent or, criminal in that sense. We were seen as maybe happy slaves or, good servants or, maybe intellectually inferior. And so we needed to have white folks, in control of us. But those kinds of frames, those kind of racialized frames, was also something that emerges in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. And so thinking about those shifts is also, really important kind of historically, because, right, if we think about how these things shift, how African Americans can go from being framed as, happy servants or happy slaves to then, thugs and criminals, right? We see how these constructions shift, so we can be prepared for how they may shift again. We can be prepared for how these ideological constructions continue to limit us. We can strategize ways of, combating it, undoing it, perhaps even imagining a better alternative. My last comment I want to say, so we're at this moment, I mentioned, COVID-19 and so many other things. We're also at this moment where just this week, yesterday, February 23rd, was the anniversary of the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, who was a jogger in Georgia, who was killed by some men who thought they could take the law enforcement in their own hands. In addition to that, on Friday, on 26th, that's the anniversary of the killing of Trayvon Martin, interestingly enough, which was 9 years ago on February 26th. Of course, we've just heard news about, for instance, in New York with Daniel Prude, another case where there was just a decision not to prosecute a man who died as a result of law enforcement. Breonna Taylor's, the anniversary of her killing, unfortunately, is coming next month in March. And so we have these things happening in our own time. And what connection can we draw between the film we just watched and these events that we're seeing? Of course, George Floyd's, the anniversary of that is coming in May of this year. And so I draw your attention to both this construction of African Americans as threatening criminals, right? That is part of the kind of rationale or the kind of ideological structure that then encourages or rationalizes or perpetuates these kinds of tragedies and injustices directed at African Americans. In addition, we can see how there is a legacy and a pattern of white supremacy and of the demonization and devaluing of Black lives and the seeing of Black people as inferior. There's a legacy of that in our country. And during Reconstruction and after the Civil War, there was a point where we could have went in different directions. Unfortunately, many of those patterns, that ideals of white supremacy and anti-Black racism continued, but it had to shift. And so one of the things that we can now see very clearly is one of those shifts is that legacy has become part of our modern policing and criminal justice system, right? Not to say that all cops are racist, of course, that's not what I'm saying. But in terms of where did that strain go? Where did that legacy of supremacy go when it can no longer hold African Americans in regular slavery in the traditional sense? Well, one of the places that strain went, that legacy kind of continues, is unfortunately in our sheriff departments and police departments and federal FBI offices and other kinds of law enforcement. That prison guards and so forth. Right, that's one place that, on an individual level, certain people who wanted to brutalize Black folks, that's where they chose to go. And also on a societal level, I think we as a country, and I'm talking about the United States, oftentimes our kind of perceptions of African Americans as less than become acted out or become channeled through the criminal justice system throughout the 20th century. So, thinking about kind of how that legacy connects to what we're seeing today, I think is also important to note. So, with those comments, I'll go ahead and ask the organizer, is there a particular question or comment that we want to start with? Go ahead and.
Yeah, my name is Stan Futch. I am one of the coordinators, community activist. Also, what I have to say is the whole thing is stretches out even to, if you look at elections, our presidential election or our Georgia's election, when they actually tried to, took that lady's win away from her, then they tried to take the back from the community and shut down the polling places early. If you look at all, and then in South Carolina, my family lives, they put every one of my black relatives have prison records, and that was to take the vote away from them. And so if you look at the film and you look at today, not much has changed. It's just more subtle. And so you see things happening today that happened then. And I was just amazed that the first white to be sent to jail for killing a black man in 1977, and the next one wasn't until 1966, that huge gap. And so by putting him in jail, they must have felt bad about it, so they won't do it again until 1966, and that's a shame.
Yeah, sometimes we have to laugh to keep from crying. Some of these things.
Exactly.
So yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. That was a poignant moment in the film.
It was.
Mark, I'm so glad that you brought in, you connected history with what is going on today in terms of policing, because we know that throughout history, law enforcement has been complicit in all of these things, whether it's the burning of Black Wall Street, the destruction of Black Wall Street, cops were involved in that. Many of the riots that whites were involved in before the 1960s, police officers were involved in that. So you have this unbroken string. So I guess the question for me is why do we expect anything different? If you know, we like James Baldwin said, you know, we see what you do. You know, that's why we don't believe what you say. And there has been this, and I think the leaders in law enforcement have been playing this kind of this dance where they try to seem fair, they try to seem like, you know, we're here to protect the entire community, and it's just not so. And I think that with in forums like this, as well as, you know, what's happening all around the United States, you know, that smoke is beginning to clear on law enforcement, and we're beginning to see really what is happening in communities across the country. I don't think white people really believe that police officers did what we said they did until they saw George Floyd get murdered right in front of our eyes. So what are your thoughts on that, Mark and Stan, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. Boy, so many thoughts come to mind. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think, you know, George Floyd's, you know, tragic murder was a wake-up call for many in our nation, because they could see it for themselves. And unfortunately, the members of the African American community and other communities of color, other marginalized groups, have been expressing these concerns for years. It was easily dismissed or not taken seriously. I think the Trump presidency and some of the ways in which that was a wake-up call also, I think, is part of the story. You know, that, you know, many Americans, many white Americans, and many folks were willing to take a second look at themselves and look at our country in a new way because of frustrations with the Trump administration. So I think those are some of the thoughts that come to mind. But I mean, in terms of the, you know, why would we expect anything different? Well, on the one hand, I think it's important to be realistic and to think, you know, we have these racial issues, we have these injustices in our country that have been around for hundreds of years. So we have to be realistic, or at least I feel like I have to be realistic, that the problem is not going to be solved overnight, right? It's perhaps going to take hundreds of years to come to terms to it and to move into a new direction. But I am eternally hopeful. I mean, I think, you know, as African Americans, you know, we can certainly teach the country about hope in spite of all hardship. And I think when I look at history, I look at African American history, I see folks who continue to struggle, who continue to hope, who continue to push forward despite what was even more dire circumstances than what I've been privileged to experience. You know, I haven't had to deal with, you know, the convict leasing system to the degree that we just saw in this film. You know, nothing close to it. And I know, you know, my grandmother grew up in a sharecropping family in rural Louisiana, and you know, got out of there as soon as she could. You know, as a young woman growing up in the World War II era. So, I guess I feel like I don't have a choice but not to be hopeful and to keep pushing forward. And so, you know, I think about, you know, this ongoing conversation around defunding the police. I think that's a good conversation to be having. And I think there are various other reforms that are being discussed that I think is good. And so, you know, I hope to do what I can to continue to push and to be part of that, both locally and nationally.
As you saw in the film, a lot of the changes were made by laws being made also. And so as we move forward, one of the hopes I have is that Black Lives Matter, all the protesters, and as things look, you know, you saw the Black Lives Matter people getting hit and beat and pushed around. And then there's a young white male walking down the street with a gun in his hand, and he's embraced by the peace officers. And so there's definitely two different sides to what's going on. And I think also, I'd like to hope there's good cops out there that see this and hopefully do the right thing. But what do you think about laws being made to make a difference?
I think it can help, right? I mean, I think that, you know, having laws certainly is part of a strategy for moving us forward. You know, and let me explain a little bit. When I talk about defunding the police, what I mean by that is a conversation, asking questions about, you know, are we putting the money in the best place for it, right? If we have mental health crises or we have a homelessness issue, should we just get more cops, you know, patrolling the streets, or are there other things we can use that money for as a state, as a city, as a community, to address those needs? That to me is the center part of the question around defunding. You know, reallocating perhaps would be another way of describing it. And I think that's good. And I think laws can be a part of that. I also think that, you know, greater education, you know, being more informed, you know, is a part of that. I think that, you know, finding ways to address, you know, tangible things like, you know, people's access to a living wage, and people's access to, you know, safe housing, and, you know, access to, you know, more broad social welfare programs and safety nets, I think would also help. It would help African Americans, and I think would help the country more broadly. And so yeah, I mean, I think there's a wide thing. I guess I don't think we have to look for the silver bullet. I think that there are many different reforms, many different kinds of approaches that we can move forward. And so, you know, for students or people in the audience out there, you know, do what feels good for you. Do what connects you. Is it working in your community and helping, you know, the elderly? Do that. You know, if it's tutoring kids, tutor kids. You know, if it's, you know, planting trees, plant trees. I mean, if it's lobbying in Sacramento, you know, go for it. I think that there, you know, all of these things can be part of a larger vision for us to move forward.
Yeah, I just had a question. One of the questions was, and I think it refers to my question about the African Americans in the South being put in prison so they couldn't vote. It's actually changed now. The laws have actually changed now. They're down south where if you have a criminal record, you can still vote depending on what that record is. But she asked, would you say there are some forms of voter suppression? And of course, that's one form of voter suppression. Can you talk about some other forms of voter suppression?
Sure. Yeah. The voter suppression, do I think that there is voter suppression? Absolutely, there is, and it's something we should definitely be really kind of hyper focused on. Really aware of. Specifically, right now, a great example is what's happening in the state of Georgia, right? So in the state of Georgia, the home of Stacey Abrams, who's one of the leading voices on voter suppression. Google her if you don't know her name, Stacey Abrams. What's happening in Georgia is that, leaders like Black woman Stacey Abrams and others have been organizing, have been pushing, have been, doing great work, and actually got a Democratic win or reform-minded candidates, I'll say. Two in the Senate, and then also the Biden win. Because of their efforts and because of getting people to vote, right? And basically, in many southern states, you have large Black communities, and if those folks vote, their policies will be implemented. But for generations, they haven't been allowed to vote, and so you have these, sort of good old boy networks continuing to be in power. Okay, so what's happening now is the state legislature in Georgia is proposing all crazy new laws where, they want to limit the drop boxes. They want to make it where you can't, vote early, right? They have certain things where you could vote early. No, they want to restrict early voting. They want to restrict absentee voting. So, there'd be more difficult to register in the first place. So perhaps you'd have to mail your driver's license in when you, submit your application or something crazy. All these kinds of things that makes it so much more difficult to access voting are being proposed. Now, some of these things are still, in proposal stage. We don't know what's going to happen. But what we see is in many states, it's not just Georgia, right? In many states, and it's not just in the South, we have these proposals, in some cases, actual laws that were put in place to make it more difficult for, people with low income, for people who are of color, for African Americans, for people who are younger, for college age folks, to make it more difficult for them to vote or to register to vote. And so absolutely, I think it's something that I think in terms of the emerging issues that I see is going to be a big deal, say in the next, couple years, kind of in the short term, I think voter suppression is definitely one of those.
Yeah, and one of the things also is redistricting down south, and like you just said, it's not just the South, because right now California is getting ready to go through their redistricting, and one of the things that we have in our area, we have a large number of African Americans in the San Bernardino area, and because of it, we have a lot of candidates that have won their elections. And when they've talked redistricting, they want to stop that power struggle that's going on. I mean, the power thing that's going on with African Americans in the local area. One of the questions is, let me see. Says not only is law enforcement complicit, but as we see from this film, so is our government. And that's one of the things that caught my eye too. Of course, we know the cops walk down the street and say, hey, you owe me some money, and they throw them in jail. But what was just the most amazing thing to me was, as you watch the president's stances, several president stances on the issue of, what was it called, peonage, you saw the president not going against it, but sitting back in his chair and saying, I'm not going to touch that. That's a South thing. And could you speak on that a little bit more?
Yeah. It's definitely something that stood out for me as well. I think about, I guess, a related kind of comment is, if you notice, so we have this, series of presidents, particularly Teddy Roosevelt kind of tries or sort of has a, bit of an attempt. but of course, there are many presidents before him and after him, in terms of after the Civil War. And then you get to the second Roosevelt, right, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, about a couple decades later. And there begins to be more movement in the 1930s, and then you get to World War II in the 1940s, and that's kind of when you finally have this key kind of crackdown, or at least robust federal effort. And why is that, right? It becomes, it's basically the national government, those in the presidency, when it starts to hit their priorities, when it starts to get in the way of what they're trying to achieve, and this is, around World War II, they were trying to project America as the, leader of democracy, and we're fighting for, liberty and justice and freedom around the world, and we're fighting against the Nazis, and so there was all this kind of propaganda around, this is why we're fighting this war. In that context, we're suddenly concerned about, what's the Imperial Japanese Army going to say, and what are these other nations going to talk about? Perhaps that might get in the way of our foreign policy goals. In many ways, that becomes the story of the 1950s and 60s, when the United States becomes much more sensitive to civil rights protests, because they're concerned about what's happening in the rest of the country, in the rest of the world, and how they may look bad in a foreign policy context when they're criticizing communist Russia or the USSR for brutalizing its citizens, right? And then there becomes a need to address the Negro problem, as it was called at the time. So all that to say, there's a certain kind of hypocrisy or cynicism, unfortunately, that's part of this story, where elected officials often turn a blind eye. And I guess what I would take away from that is that it reflects how it really takes more than just a president, right? When it comes to any president, Barack Obama and whoever else, Joe Biden. If we depend on this one office or this one person to address the issues that we need to be addressed, we're going to be waiting a long time. And perhaps circumstances will change, and we might have another world war, and who knows. But I think if we as a community, as Mr. Futch is saying, if we're paying attention to redistricting, if we're pushing our elected officials, if we're having a local presence, that can make sure that our issues remain a priority. Because if we just leave it up to those in charge, they're going to do it when they get around to it, and that may be a long time.
Yeah, and yesterday Mary hosted a real good show. It was the Atlanta Washers Women's Strike, and what you said just earlier is it when it affects them personally, they'll look at it and hold it as a priority, and that's what happened in the Washerwomen's Strike. They were getting ready to host a World's Fair, and these women were on strike, and we can't have that, not right now. So they had to react to it, and so you're right, timing's everything. As it comes to law enforcement, and that's what we talk about as policing, the amazing thing then and the amazing thing now, but little less now because we have cell phone cameras, we have, everyone's on video. And so, but the ability of a police officer to walk up to anybody and falsely accuse them of doing anything, it still exists. And that's the hard fix. The hard fix is that man's an individual. And so we have to battle with that. Can you speak on that mentality a little bit?
Okay. So if I understood the question, I'm commenting on the mentality where cops feel like they can go up to any person, particularly any African-American person, and treat them however they will. So yeah, I mean, I think we need accountability. I mean, I think there needs to be real punishment. right? I think we have this pattern where police officers commit murder or someone, they kill people or perhaps brutalize someone, and they get maybe some, death duty, or they get put on leave, paid leave in many cases, and there's an investigation, and then they eventually are not charged, or the investigation grand jury decides not to indict, I think there needs to be some interruption to that path, right? Where, if you kill someone or if you commit misconduct, there is clear and serious repercussions. And those repercussions can be financial, where they could be fined or some kind of, docking of pay. Right now we have a system where the city government or the state may pay damages to the family, but, the family of the victim who was killed by the police. But the actual officers face little, if any, financial penalty. So it can be financial penalties, it can be, jail time, it could be, loss of their jobs and loss of, future earnings or other kinds of, other kind of punishment. So that needs to change, right? So that's one thing. And I'm hopeful, right? I think people are more aware, that could happen. I think the second thing that needs to happen is, I think we as a nation, right, all of Americans really need to look within and think about, what has been our relationship, our conception of policing over the last, over our lifetime, we'll say. Because in many ways, we as a country have cheered on get tough on crime policy, right? If it was watching cops on television, or whether it was some kind of, NCIS TV show or some, movie, and the cops kick down someone's door and throw someone on the ground and, throw them around in the interrogation room and so forth, right? There's a way in which that was very popular, right? And when politicians would run for office, they're running for mayor, they're running for governor, and say, I'm going to get tough on crime, and I'm not going to show any mercy, and I'm going to lock up every, son of a gun I can find. Those people were elected, right? Now, Republicans were, in many cases, kind of out in front on this law and order kind of theme. But the Democrats also, ran for office and won elections promoting this get tough on crime, crack down on the inner city, gang busters and all this kind of stuff, which always had this subtext, at least since the 1960s, right? And you can say even earlier with, the convict leasing system, there was always this kind of subtext of racism, right? Of the idea that some people are inferior, some people are more criminal, and those people are generally the brown people or the black people or, the non-white people. Something's wrong with those people. They're dangerous. We need to crack down and bust them in the head and show them who's boss. And people say, yay, all right, I'm voting for that guy. And that's on us, right? Police, non-police. I think we as a nation really need to think about, what kind of police do we want? Because I think in a sad way, the kind of like really aggressive and really, prone to violence. Of course, not all police are bad, again, but the kind of pattern of policing that, very much, dominating and warrior mentality. I think that's what we as a nation actually wanted. I think that's what we voted for. I think that's what we chose to fund. And so I think we need to look at ourselves to think about how we move in a different direction. So I think those are two things, right? Individual accountability, societal-wise, for rethinking about what is public safety. what's going to make us safe? Is it really is it the brown people that's making us unsafe? Or is it, lack of a living wage?
Yeah.
There's another question that I'm gonna interject. It looks like someone
Police union.
immediately putting it in. So it says, what hope, if any, exists for POC communities to tell the white Americans the realities in which these United States are founded? Question. How can anyone make the case to whites that this is the United States of America, not to Leave It to Beaver? That's an old reference. Okay, kids, Google Leave It to Beaver because you're maybe too young. Is it easy to wake up those who are asleep? Is it impossible to wake up those who pretend to be asleep? Okay, so perhaps Mr. Futch may want to answer this one too, but a thought, I think that in terms of, how do we talk to white folks and kind of get them on board? I think, one answer would be, there are many white folks who are already on board, right? Who already at least get it, or they're listening, or they're trying to be supportive. And so I think, one answer that I'll borrow from other people is perhaps we could lean on the white folks who are with it to kind of help explain it to the white folks who maybe aren't. So I think that's one way we can imagine it. I also think that when it comes to sort of creating a more just society, sometimes I guess I'll put it this way: if we focus on those who are harmed and we address the harm, so whether it be communities that are over-policed as a harm, or whether it be the criminalization of marijuana and those who have been, caught up in, the drug war and that kind of harm. If we address those people who have been harmed and address their harm, I think that actually could do a lot of good. And even if the white folks who aren't with it aren't necessarily persuaded, I think they can grow to adjust to a more, to a society that's more fair. And if they can't, at least the people who have been harmed have been assisted, or have been, the issues have been addressed, at least somewhat. So in some ways, that's kind of how I think about it, in terms of, I don't necessarily know exactly how we totally get white folks on board, the ones who still aren't, but those are some of my thoughts that come to mind. Mr. Futch, would you like to?
The thing I see as a way to bring people in is what's going on with our young people. Our young people are so tech savvy, and so what they're seeing is they're seeing so much footage of things that should not happen. And I think that's one of the things that, like when Black Lives Matter were marching, you saw a rainbow of people. And I think the fact of the matter is, George Floyd's death woke up a lot of people, and then as you saw Aubrey's death, you saw more and more people come on board, because it became not a one-time thing. It became it was like a monthly thing, and people were like, "What's going on?" And then they've heard about the things that happened in the past, they got on board. So I think the true way is the way our young people are broadcasting, TikToking, and making people aware of what's going on. And Mary, I gotta say this, a really good job yesterday on that program, and I really enjoyed it. Why don't you jump in here, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them.
I'm on mute because my dogs are they're not obeying me. I think, I don't have a problem with any of the comments that have been made, and I think they've been pretty accurate. But the thing I keep going back to is that we have got to make policing, we've got to understand policing in the context of a structure, of a system. and not of just individual officers who may be good. Or, you know, we teach all the time in Race and Racism that you don't have to be a racist to practice racism. You do not have to be, I mean, you can enforce laws, you can, you know, take people to jail, you can do all of these things, and you can be a perfectly nice person. And so I would like us to think more structurally than just, you know, on an individual basis. And Mark, you asked the question, you know, what do we want from our police? And I think, you know, Michael Harrington wrote two or three decades ago, you know, that we are a divided nation. And, you know, Du Bois wrote about that, you know, over 100 years ago. We are one white, one black, and, you know, sort of everybody else in between. So white people want something different from policing, and I'm talking in generalities now, than black people. White people want black people to be kept away from them because they're dangerous, they're thugs. And black people want to just stop being killed. You know, that's two different, I mean, and there is a huge, huge gulf between those two realities, I think.
Well, Mr. Robertson, thank you so much for being here today and bringing that fantastic video to us. I hadn't seen it, and I see a lot of stuff. And when I saw that, I thought, how come I haven't seen that one? And so thank you for bringing that to us, and so much to learn from what we saw. And we are going to let you go, get you out of here, and we thank you so much for being a part of our panel and talking to our not only us but our students, especially our students, and hope to see you again in the future.
I know you could do another 2 hours, Mark, but we do have to let you go because this is a great conversation, though, and I hope you'll come back.
Well, thank you. And yeah, Mary, you're always, Dr. Texeira, I should say,
oh, please,
really pushing us with these really deep and profound questions. And so, you know, thinking about, you know, how do we think more structurally is a great point. And certainly, you know, thinking about, you know, our local, state, you know, city governments and kind of how they function, and how policing kind of, you know, whether cops are good or bad, functions to target poor people, right? I mean, you know, even setting aside race, you know, people who end up in jail, people who can't pay their bail, people who can't afford good lawyers, you know, et cetera, it oftentimes comes down to criminalizing poverty and taking advantage of the most vulnerable. And you throw racial bias on top of that, and, you know, we have a whole big problem. So, you know, really, yeah, sort of thinking about how, you know, what happens to a little baby who's born and 20 years later ends up in prison, right? Mm-hmm. What happens in the school system? What happens in the medical care system? What happens in housing? What happens in the, you know, in the environment, the quality of the air, the lead in the paint, and the drinking water? You know, what happens, you know, in the access to all kinds of resources? I think I said schooling already, but obviously what happens in the K-12 system? I think that's the kind of structural and institutional analysis that you're pushing us towards, because when that baby's born, they're innocent, right? Mm-hmm. Harmless, all the potential in the world. And something happens where, you know, they end up incarcerated, sometimes because of choices that they made, sometimes because of just circumstances. But thinking about that context is definitely important, and really that's the structural analysis that we also need to keep in focus. So it's a great question. I'll continue to ponder it. Thank you for having me as a part of this series, part of this event. It was a pleasure, it was an honor. I appreciate the audience for sticking with us. And so please, I'd be happy to have me back. But again, thank you.
And we need to point out that you were one of the original organizers of this event, but forces beyond your control and ours have kept you away from us for a while, but you're always welcome back, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Good to
Appreciate
see
that.
you. Take care.